don't chase trends. We on the wave. Legos to the world. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build.
Continent DNA.
In our last episode, the Cocoa Century, we traced how Ivory Coast became the world's cocoa superpower and how that power became a trap. Today, we complete the story. We are looking at one of the multinationals sitting at the center of that trap. There are no villains here, I have to say, only incentives and structure. If you haven't heard that episode yet, go back and start there. This one lands harder when you do. So let us begin. Pick up a chocolate bar, any chocolate bar. It does not matter if it is a $2 gas station impulse buy or a $12 artisan in a brown paper with a farm name printed on the back. Pick it up, turn it over, read the label. You will see a brand name, maybe Cadbury, maybe Nestle, maybe some name you have never heard of. You will see sugar, cocoa butter, vanilla extract. You will see a calorie count you are probably going to ignore. What you won't see is the name of the company that actually made the chocolate inside that wrapper. That company is called Barry Callebaut. And there is a better than 1 in 4 chance statistically that they made the chocolate you are holding right now. Not the brand, not the marketing, the actual chocolate you are eating right now. The stuff your teeth are about to hit. You have never heard of them. That is not an accident. Barry Callebaut is a Swiss Belgian company headquartered in Zurich. They process roughly 2.2 million metric tons of cocoa every year. To give that number a body, that is 1 in every cocoa beans grown anywhere on earth every single year. Their clients are the biggest names in food: Nestle, Mondelez, the company that makes Cadbury and Oreo, Unilever, and hundreds more. But here is the thing: you will almost certainly never find the name Barry Callebaut on a food label because they don't sell to you. They sell to the companies selling to you. They are the manufacturer's manufacturer, the factory behind the factory, the invisible empire inside every chocolate bar on earth. And today, we are going to make them visible. I am Tobe Duru. Welcome to Continent DNA, the show about great opportunities in Africa, the DNA of markets, and the playbook to thrive in them. And this episode is not just about a company, it is about a system, a global system for turning a West African crop into one of the most consumed food products on earth. A system where the country that grows the ingredients captures almost none of the money that ingredients generates. That is the story. Let's start with a question, a simple one. When you buy a chocolate bar, Where do you think the chocolate comes from? Most people would say from the brand. Cadbury makes it. Nestle makes it. Someone, somewhere has a factory and they made it. The answer increasingly is none of them. Here is something most people don't know. The big food companies, Nestle, Mars, Mondelez, most of them don't actually make their own chocolate anymore. At some point, quietly, they decided it wasn't worth the trouble. It was too capital intensive, too complex to make, not their core business. So they handed it off. And the company they handed it to, you have almost certainly never heard of them. But you have eaten the product probably this week. They built their entire business around one idea: be the factory the world's biggest brands did not want to run themselves. That company is Barry Callebaut. The story begins in 1996. Two struggling mid-sized European chocolate companies, Callebaut, founded in 1911 in a small Belgian town called Wieze in German. In English, Wieze, which is Wieze, and Coco Barry, founded in Paris in 1842, were merged by a Swiss industrialist named Klaus Jacobs. Klaus Jacobs understood something that almost nobody else at that time did. And on the other side, you had the big commodity traders, Cargill, Ashi, Daniels, Midland, companies that are extraordinarily good at moving raw ingredients around the world at scale. Cocoa beans from Ivory Coast to Rotterdam, they have got to be covered. But refining those beans into the exact chocolate that Nestle or Cadbury needs for their specific product, consistent batch after batch, year after year, that is a completely different skill set, and it wasn't theirs. So there was a gap right in the middle between the bean and the brand. And nobody had built a serious, scaled professional operation to fill it. That was the bet. That was the founding logic of Barry Callebaut. Not to compete with the brands, not to compete with the commodity traders, but to sit in the middle and become so deeply embedded in the operations of the brands that they could never afford to leave. 3 years after the merger of Callebaut and Coco Barry in 1999, a Swiss operator named Ernest Tanner walked into the CEO chair. He would stay for 16 years. And in that time, he built something that does not get talked about nearly enough: a business strategy so precise, so methodical that looking back at it now almost feels unfair. like watching someone play chess while everyone else is playing checkers. The core insight wasn't complicated. In fact, when you hear it, your first reaction is probably going to be, well, obviously. But that is not the thing about great strategic thinking. It only looks obvious after someone else does it first. He said the major food companies will outsource their chocolate manufacturing if you give them a reason to. Not some of them, not the small ones, the giants. Convince Nestle, the largest food company on earth, to hand you their factories, and every other food company in the world is suddenly paying very close attention. Because if Nestle is doing it, maybe they should be doing it too. In 2012, Nestle did exactly that. They transferred several of their own chocolate manufacturing facilities to Barry Callebaut and became Barry Callebaut's client. The world's largest food company sold its chocolate factories to its own supplier and paid that supplier to make its chocolate for it. That is not a transaction. That is a declaration. Here is a question you might be asking right now. If Barry Callebaut is just making chocolate for other brands, why can't those brands just leave? Why can't Nestle decide tomorrow to take it back in house, build new factories, hire engineers, make their own chocolate again? The answer to that question is the most important thing in this entire episode. And it explains everything about how Barry Callebaut became unbeatable. Think about Amazon Web Services. You have heard of AWS, even if you have never thought much about it. AWS is the invisible infrastructure that powers Netflix, Airbnb, and roughly a third of the internet. They don't make movies, they don't rent apartments, but without them, neither Netflix nor Airbnb could operate at the scale they do. Barry Callebaut is the AWS of chocolate. And once you are inside the system, living is not a business decision. It is an infrastructure project that takes years and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Here is why. When Nestle handed Barry Callebaut its factories, it did not just hand over buildings and machines, it handed over recipes, formulations, the precise proprietary mixture of ingredients that makes a Kit Kat taste like a Kit Kat in Switzerland, Japan, in Brazil, or anywhere in the world where you find yourself. Same taste, same texture, every market, every time. And Barry Callebaut's engineers are the ones who know exactly how to do that. Those recipes live inside their systems, their processes, their supply chain, not yours. Which means if you ever wanted to bring that back in house, even if you wanted to, you are looking at years of rebuilding, certifications, audit, retraining. It is not impossible. It is just painful enough that nobody does it. But it goes deeper than recipes because Barry Callebaut also took on something that nobody really talks about, all the compliance, food safety, allergy management, and what have you, proving that the cocoa in your product did not come from a deforested hillside in West Africa. That last one, especially right now, governments in Europe are passing laws that require brands to show exactly where their cocoa came from and how it was grown. The paper trail, the audits, the certifications. Barry Callebaut built that infrastructure, which means the brands are not just relying on them to make their chocolate, they are relying on them to stay legal. Think about what that means. Barry Callebaut's clients don't just need to make chocolate, they need them to prove that the chocolate is ethical, traceable, and legally compliant. Two dependencies layered on top of each other. And then there is the co-location model. In the most committed arrangements, Barry Callebaut does not just supply chocolate from a factory across the country. They built their facility right next to the client's facility, sometimes inside it. The physical integration makes the commercial separation almost theoretical. And then there is something even more elegant than all of that. Barry Callebaut runs a global network of training centers for pastry chefs, chocolatiers, food scientists, people early in their careers learning how to work with chocolate. The training is free or heavily subsidized, and it is all done using Callebaut and cacao berry products. So the person who spends 2 years learning their craft on Barry Callebaut chocolate, when they graduate, when they get hired as an R&D lead or a pastry head at one of the major food companies, what do they specify? What do they trust? What do they already know how to use? You don't even need to ask. This is not charity. This is the most elegant client acquisition strategy in the food industry. Train the next generation of professionals on your products, and they will request your products until they retire. By the time Turner stepped down in 2015, Barry Callebaut processed roughly one in every four cocoa beans on Earth. It manufactured chocolate for most of the world's major food companies. At some point, it stops being a company and starts being something closer to plumbing. You don't think about it, you don't see it. But the moment it stops working, everything stops working. That is not a company, that is infrastructure. Now, I want you to hold two pictures in your head at the same time. The first one, a farmer in the western part of Ivory Coast. He is up before sunrise. He walks out into his farm, dense trees, thick paws hanging off the trunks, bright orange and yellow when they are ripe. He has about 4 hectares of land. If you have never thought about what 4 hectares look like, imagine 5 or 6 football pitches. That is his world. That is what he works. In a good year, a genuinely good year, he is making around three, maybe up to $4,500 before he pays for anything. That is the bottom of this system. The cocoa he harvests will travel from his farm to a cooperative, from the cooperative to an exporter, from the exporter to a processor, quite possibly Barry Callebaut, from the processor to a manufacturer, from the manufacturer to a brand, from the brand to a supermarket shelf somewhere in London or New York. And on that shelf, it will be sold at a retail price of roughly $8 to $15 per kilogram of finished chocolate. The farmer captured approximately 3 to 6% of that terminal value. Now, here is where I have to be very precise because this episode is not about guilt, it's not about blame. The farmer's position in this chain is not the result of any single bad actor. It is the result of a system, a centuries old system designed for something very specific. And that system has done exactly what it was designed to do. Ivory Coast produces roughly 40 to 45% of all the cocoa on earth. Add Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, and West Africa accounts for approximately 70% of global cocoa supply. The entire global chocolate industry, every bar, every truffle, every cup of hot chocolate on earth is built on a foundation that sits almost entirely in West Africa. And yet, West Africa captures less than 3% of what the world pays for chocolate. How does that happen? Not emotionally, but structurally. The answer starts in the 1890s. Cocoa is not native to Africa. Theobroma cacao, the tree that produces cocoa pods, is native to Mesoamerica. It was brought to West Africa by European colonial powers in the late 19th century, specifically because land was available and labor was cheap. The infrastructure built to manage cocoa production was designed for one purpose: efficient extraction for European industry. Grow the raw material in Africa, ship it to Europe, process it in Amsterdam, turn it into chocolate, sell it to the world. That was the game plan. That infrastructure did not collapse. When the colonial era ended, the trade routes stayed, the processing facilities stayed, the commodity exchanges in London and New York still running and setting prices as we talk. And I want to be careful here because this is not a story about evil men in rooms deciding to keep Africa poor. It is actually a smaller story than that. Capital, once it concentrates somewhere, creates its own gravity. It pulls the next investment and the next one and the next one after that. That is the nature of things. Every investment went where prior investment had already gone. And so here we are in 2026, and that farmer in Ivory Coast is still exactly where he was 20, 30, 40 years ago. At the start of the chain, nothing about that has changed. So here is the question every listener is now asking, the obvious question, the fair question. If Ivory Coast grows 45% of the world's cocoa, why don't Ivory Coast make 45% of the world's chocolate? Why not just build the factories, process the cocoa locally, add the margin, keep the value? The first barrier is money. Building a world class chocolate manufacturing facility that can compete with Barry Callebaut costs between 50 million and $150 million. That is just the upfront capital. Sustaining it, the working capital, the hedging against cocoa price swings, the ongoing equipment investment requires long term industrial financing at competitive interest rates. Industrial financing at that scale, with those terms in West Africa, has historically been extremely difficult to access, not because African businesses are untrustworthy, but because nobody ever built the financial infrastructure to make that kind of long term industrial investment possible, not at the scale it would actually require. The second barrier is the market. Getting a finished chocolate product onto a supermarket shelf in London or New York requires retail relationships, food safety certification, cold chain logistics, and brand equity that takes decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to develop. And Barry Callebaut's biggest clients, the Nestors, the Mondelez of the world, they are not going to help an African chocolate maker eat into their own shelf space. That is just not how business works. But here is a third barrier, and this one almost never gets talked about. It is not a company decision, it is not a handshake deal. It is written into the actual rules of global trade. The EU, the US, Japan, the biggest chocolate markets on earth, they all do the same thing. Raw cocoa beans come in, zero tariffs, free, no charge at all. But finished chocolate, a chocolate bar made in factory in Abidjan, that faces higher import taxes. Sit with that for a moment. The more work Ivory Coast does, the more value it adds, the more processing it handles, the more it gets taxed for selling that product abroad. The system is literally more expensive to navigate. The further up the value chain you try to climb, and here is the part that is hard to sit with. Those tariff structures weren't accidents, they were negotiated, written into trade agreements at a time when most African governments were in no position to push back, no industrial base to protect, no leverage at the table. So they signed, and the architecture stayed. Three barriers: capital, market access, trade architecture. And none of those three things happened in isolation. They reinforced each other over decades until the outcome we are looking at today started to feel inevitable. Not because anyone sat in a room and planned it that way, but because the system did not need anyone to. But here is where it gets interesting because the system is not without cracks. The first crack is in consumer behavior. In the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan, a growing number of people are willing to pay a premium for chocolate they can trace to a specific farm, a specific community, a real origin story. And that market being to bar single origin craft chocolate is now worth over $3 billion, and it is growing every year. And this is where something interesting happens because that market, traceable, origin specific, story driven chocolate, requires something that Barry Callebaut, for all its scale and infrastructure, genuinely cannot manufacture. The actual place, the actual farmer, the actual story, you cannot build that in a factory in Belgium. You either have it or you don't. And Ivory Coast has it. And there are companies right now already proving that. Fair Afrique, based in Ghana, is making finished chocolate bars in Accra and selling them into premium markets in Europe. Not cocoa beans, but finished chocolate bars with their own branding, their own story, their own margin. The volumes are still small, but the fact that it is working at all is the signal Africa needs. The second crack is regulation. The European Union has passed a law requiring any cocoa entering the European market to be traceable to GPS mapped farms, with proof that no deforestation occurred after December 2020. This sounds like a burden on African producers, more paperwork, more cost, more compliance. But there is another reason. If you build the traceability infrastructure, if you GPS map the farms, create the data system, build the cooperative level audit capacity, you have something European processors don't have at the same level of origin authenticity. Compliance infrastructure built at origin becomes a competitive asset. It becomes the thing that makes your chocolate more sellable in Europe, not less. And then there is the 2024 cocoa price shock. In early 2024, the price of cocoa on international markets briefly exceeded $10,000 per metric ton. And that number did not come from nowhere. West Africa had taken a beating, bad weather, season after season, and the farms themselves have been starved of investment for years. Nobody had modernized, nobody had prepared. So when supply dropped, it really dropped. Barry Callebaut started flagging volume problems. The big chocolate brands started quietly hiking prices. And if you were shopping in a supermarket in Germany or even in the UK around that time, you may have noticed something. Your chocolate bar looked the same wrapper, same brand, but it was just a little smaller than it used to be. That is how you know a supply chain is in trouble. Not from a press release, but from the size of your Tuesday afternoon snack. The whole industry was suddenly very awake to something it has spent decades not thinking about. There is no chocolate without West Africa. That dependency, the structural dependency of $130 billion global industry on a supply base concentrated in a handful of West African countries, is a lever. It has not yet been fully used, but it exists. And the people who understand it are already starting to ask questions. Let me bring this back to where we started, that chocolate bar, the one in your hand at the beginning of this episode. You now know the full chain. The farmer in Ivory Coast who grew the bean, earning somewhere between 3 and 6% of what you paid for the finished product. The processing network, anchored by a Swiss Belgian company you have never heard of, that turned that bean into chocolate at a margin the farmer never sees. The brand that puts its name on the wrapper and the gap, the enormous structural, historical, constructed gap between what the farmer earned and what you paid. Here is what I want to leave you with. Two things. First, Barry Callebaut is not the villain of this story. The company is a rational actor operating within a system it did not design. It found the most defensible position in a value chain, the unsexy middle, and built an architecture that makes that position almost impossible to contest. That is not exploitation, that is strategy. And if you are a builder or an investor, the lesson is not that Barry Callebaut is bad. The lesson is that whoever builds the Barry Callebaut of African markets, whoever identifies the unsexy middle of emerging African value chain and builds the infrastructure to own it, that person is building something generational. Second, the barriers to African value capture in cocoa are real. They are specific. They are historical, constructed, which means, and this is the most important part, they are reversible, not overnight, not through one big policy moment or one company cracking the code. It is more like pressure building from multiple directions at once, but it is possible. The being to bar movement is real and it is growing. The EU's new traceability rules, the ones forcing companies to prove exactly where their cocoa came from, are quietly building infrastructure right there at origin. The price shock of 2024 reminded the entire industry that West Africa is sitting on supply leverage it has never really used. And that last point matters more than people realize. When the world ran short, nobody could just go somewhere else. The cocoa was there. It has always been there. And a new generation of Africa entrepreneurs in Accra, in Abidjan, in Lagos are asking the question this entire episode has been building toward. Why is Africa selling the ingredient? Why is Africa not selling chocolate? That question, asked loud enough, built into enough business plans, backed by enough capital, and protected by enough smart policy, that question is the beginning of a different story. Barry Callebaut built an empire by being indispensable and invisible. Africa has not yet built its Barry Callebaut. The window to do that is shorter than most people think. I am Tobe Duru. This is Continent DNA. If this episode made you see something you could not unsee, share it. Send it to someone who builds things. Send it to someone who invests in things. Send it to someone who just loves chocolate and has never thought about where it comes from. Because the story of Barry Callebaut is not really about chocolate. It is about who gets to build the infrastructure that everyone else depends upon and who gets left out
We don't
when
chase
they do.
trends. We the wave. Legos to the world. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build. We brave. We build. We build.
Continent